We are on the bottom of DAF Vavim at Bays at the two dots, the last line. Amar Rava. Rava said the following halacha. Tein mona leploni v'ikadesh ani lach mikudeshes midin arev. If a woman says to a man, she says to him as follows, listen, I'm willing to marry you, but don't give me the money for Kiddushin, give it to my brother or to some other guy. Give it to that person. So the law is, as long as the man delivers the money, then that is a way for a woman to become married. The chiddush of the Gemara is that she does not have to receive the money in order to be married. In other words, and the way the mechanism whereby this works is the same mechanism that a person can commit himself as a guarantor on a loan. And the Gemara speaks it out. Arev lav afal gavdelo mati hana liyade kamishabed nafshe. Hai itzanami afal gavdelo mati hana liyada kamishabda umiknaya nafsha. That just like a person who's acting as a guarantor on a loan does not have to receive anything in order to indebt himself to this transaction, so too a woman can transfer herself or indebt herself to her husband without receiving anything, as long as the husband gives over money. So that's chiddush number one. Chiddush number two, says Rava, is Helech mana v'hiskadshi liploni mikudeshes midin eved kanani. Now let's look at the opposite case, where a man goes over to a woman and he says, I have been authorized by Ploni over there who would like to marry you. He doesn't have money to give you Kiddushin, but he's asked me to figure out a way for you to marry him. So here, I'm taking $100 out of my pocket and I'm paying for your Kiddushin. With this $100, you are hereby married to Ploni. So Rava says that that's good. And of course the chiddush is that even though the husband is not paying anything, as long as the woman is receiving something of value, that's a valid Kiddushin. And how do we know that that works? We know that works because of the principle of an Eved Kanani acquiring his freedom from slavery. That Eved Kanani, lav, afal gav delo kachaser velo midi kakoni nafshe, hai gavranami afal gav delo kachaser velo midi kakoni la lahai itza. That just like an Eved Kanani does not have to pay for his own emancipation, meaning that if I'm a good Samaritan and I see a guy who's Eved Kanani and I want to buy his freedom, I can pay, and he as long as someone is paying the owner, the Eved acquires his freedom. It doesn't have to be the Eved himself. So too, a man who wishes to acquire a woman does not have to pay for it himself, just like the Eved Kanani does not have to pay to acquire his own freedom, his own independence. Okay? So you see the analogy. So the chiddush of the first case is that even though the woman is not receiving anything, as long as the man is paying something, it's a good kiddushin. And the chiddush of the second case is that even though the husband is not paying anything, as long as the woman is receiving money, then it's a valid kiddushin. Now let's go and extend that and combine the two past cases and learn an even bigger chiddush, which is Tein mana leploni v'ikadesh ani lo mikudeshes midin shnehem. That what if a woman goes over to a guy who she knows has money and she says, give that guy that I would like to marry, give him $100, bless you, and through you giving him $100, it's as if you're giving me $100 on his behalf, and I will thereby be married to him. So you're using both properties here. Here the husband is not pulling anything out of his pocket, and the woman is not receiving anything. Instead, the husband is receiving, and the woman is getting nothing. But the Gemara says, applying both the principle of Arev and the principle of an Eved Kanani acquiring his freedom, this too will constitute a proper Kiddushin. Because Arev, lav afal gav delo kamati hana liyade kamishabed nafshe, hai itzanami afal gav delo kamati hana liyada kamiknaya nafsha. That using the principle of Arev, of acting as a guarantor, we see that a guarantor can indebt himself even though he's not acquiring anything quid pro quo, Similarly, this woman is not acquiring the $100. She's asking it to be given to her future husband, but since it's being done on her behalf, just like a guarantor can indebt himself, so too this woman can indebt herself to the marriage. But the Gemara says, one second, mi dame. But how can you make that a comparison? Because arev hay de kakani le kachaser mamona, hay gabra kakani la hay itza velo kachaser velo midi. But the Gemara says, how can you make the analogy? And arev, at least, is that the ki hay de kakani le kachaser mamona. In other words, what is the case? In a case of a loan which has a guarantor, the malva is laying out the money, and he benefits from the guarantor's indebtedness. So there is a certain quid pro quo in the sense that the person who's laying out the money acquires the indebtedness in exchange for his outlay of money for the loan. But in this case, the person who's outlaying the money is not acquiring the woman's indebtedness to marriage. She's giving that indebtedness to her husband, who's not laying out money, but rather is getting money. So the Gemara answers, Eved Kanani Yochiach, Delo Kachaser Mamona V'Kakani Nafshe. So you go to the case of Eved Kanani, and you see that even though a person is not outlaying money, an Eved Kanani who's acquiring his freedom, by having someone else purchase his freedom, he's not outlaying money and he can still acquire benefit. So therefore, it works out that even though you're not the party that's outlaying the money, you can still acquire the benefit of this woman's marriage to you. But the Gemara says, but there are two midame. Hasam hachdeka makni kakani, hacha hay itza kameknaya nafsha velo kakanya velo midi. But the Gemara says, but still, how can you compare the case of Eved Kanani? At least the person who is giving over the Eved Kanani, the master, is at least acquiring the money to free the slave. But here, the woman is not acquiring any money. It's one thing if she receives the money from a third party and then she can indebt or give over herself to her husband. That's one thing. But the woman who is receiving, the woman is not receiving the money here, like in Eved Kanani, like the Eved Kanani's master. So how can you say that this is like a case of Eved Kanani? But the Gemara then says, Arev Yochiach. That then we go to the case of Arev. So that by an Arev, even though the Arev is not acquiring anything, he can nevertheless indebt himself. So therefore, using a combination of these two cases, the case of Arev and the case of Eved Kanani, it turns out that even when the husband is not outlaying money and the woman is not receiving money, as long as there is an outlay of cash that satisfies the wishes of the woman, then that constitutes a proper kiddushin. You don't need the husband to outlay the money, and you don't need the woman to receive the money. As long as there's an outlay of cash and it satisfies the woman's wishes, that's enough to make her into a woman who's mikudeshes. So now the Gemara says the next case. Amar Boy Rava. Rava asked the following question. Heilach mone v'ikadesh anilach. What if a woman goes over to a man? This is a great way to solve the shidduch crisis, right? Woman goes over to a man and says, here's $100. With this $100, I will be married to you. So, simple. Like, buyachassan.com, right? Simple, right? So, does this work as an act of kiddushin or not? So, Amar Marzutra Mishmei Derav Papa Mikudeshes. He says, yes, it works. It doesn't, since there's no requirement for the man to outlay the money, even if the woman outlays the money, there's a valid kiddushin. Now the question, of course, is, how does it work? What's the mechanism? Normally, the man has to present the woman with an object of value. So how does it work over here? So Amrle Rav Ashi Lamar Zutra Imkain Havale Nachasim Sheish Lamachrayas Niknamim Nachasim Shein Lamachrayas Va'anan Ibcha Tanan Nachasim Shein Lamachrayas Niknamim Nachasim Sheish Lamachrayas Bekesef Tishkara Bachazaka. The question is, now the way this question is being phrased is asked by Rav Ashi, is that Rav Ashi makes a certain assumption as to how this process is working. His assumption is that the process of how this is working is through what we call a kinyan agav. What is a kinyan agav? that once I have a valid mechanism of transfer for A, I can use that same mechanism for B, even though I haven't made a direct valid mechanism of kinyan for B. But since the two of them are being transferred concomitantly, whatever method works for A will work for B as well. And therefore, Rav Ashi was under the assumption as follows, that since a woman is transferring money to her future husband, concomitant with that transfer of money, which is a gift, she can also transfer herself over to her husband. Because in one sense, what is Kiddushin? It's a legal transfer of ownership of the wife from herself to her husband. She's transferring her person from herself to her husband in one sense. And therefore, even though she has not utilized the proper method of kinyan in order for that transfer to take place, because normally the husband has to outlay cash or kesef shtar and bia in order to acquire her, but we're utilizing the process of agav, that since she is giving him a gift of cash, and this is a proper mechanism of just giving it to him for the cash to transfer from her to him, so agav, the cash gift, she can also transfer herself from her to him. That's the assumption, says Rav Ashi, and Rav Ashi says, but that's problematic. The process or the mechanism of kinyan agav only works when you do it in the opposite. When you legally transfer land or a human being, which is the same din of land, because we know that avodim iskeshu lekarkos, when there's a transfer of human sale, like slavery, the same mechanisms of kinyan that work for real estate work for human beings. So Rav Ashi says, we know that kinyan agav works, that when you're using a valid mechanism of transfer for real estate and humans, that same mechanism will work for chattel. But we've never seen that using a valid mechanism for chattel will work to also transfer real estate or human beings, which is what you're suggesting. So the classic case of kinyan agav is, let's say I want to sell you a piece of real estate, and on the real estate are a dozen wheelbarrows. So by selling you the real estate and you making a kinyan on the real estate, you can also be kona the wheelbarrows, even though you didn't do a hagba'ah or a mashicha of the wheelbarrows, which would normally be required. It's a supplementary kind of sale. That's what agav means. It's a supplementary kind of process. So the question that Rav Ashi is asking is, if you're using the mechanism of kinyan agav, you're applying it in the reverse. Kinyan agav only works when you're using the valid mechanism for real estate or humans, and you supplement chattel. But when you're using the valid mechanism for chattel and you want to supplement real estate and humans, that doesn't work. So amrlei mi savras da amrlei agav. So the answer to Rav Ashi is, your premise was mistaken. We're not working using a kinyan agav. I agree with you that would not work. What's going on over here is that this man is a VIP. He's a very important person. He's a legend in his own mind, right? And so the importance of this person is such that she feels so privileged that he accepted my gift, that provides her with a tangible benefit. So in other words, like he says, I don't need anything. I'm Donald Trump. I don't want your donations, right? But he says, but you, madam, I'll make an exception for. I'll accept your donation. And so she feels so privileged that he's accepting her gift. It's as if she's receiving something in exchange for that receipt of the gift. And it's with that hana'ah of the privilege of him accepting my gift that she is considered married to him. That's the reason why, because she's receiving at the same time that she's giving. So the Gemara now says, Itmar nami mishmei de Rava v'chein le'inyan mamona. Now, going back to Rava's statement before, that you can use the mechanism of Arev and the mechanism of Eved Kenani, such that you don't need that the that the husband outlays cash, and you don't need that the wife receives the cash in order for kesef to work for kiddushin, as long as her wishes of giving money to somebody is achieved. Rava says the same thing applies to buying and selling. When it comes to making a kinyan for purchases, let's say I want to buy your widget. Normally, when I want to buy your widget, I have to give you $100 for your widget. But Rava says, I can acquire your widget even without my outlaying of cash, and even without your receipt of the cash, using the methods of Arev and Eved Kanani that we discussed just a moment ago. As long as you, the seller, wish for the money to go to X, and I have Y party who can outlay the money, then that's sufficient for me to be kona your widget. So the Gemara says, utsricha. Why is it necessary for Rava to point this out? Why does Rava have to point this out both in cases of marriage and both in cases of purchases and sales? So di'yash min kiddushin mishum daha'itza nichala b'choltehu k'deresh lakish da'amaresh lakish tav l'meitav tandu milameitav armalu avol mamona emalo. The Gemara says if Rava had only told us that this type of exchange works in marriage, maybe it only works in marriage, even though there's no outlay from the husband and intake from the wife, simply because it's very simple for a woman to create a marriage to her husband, because every woman wants to be married, Reish Lakish said, which is a very sexist thing to say, but sexism is not necessarily pejorative. In other words, there is clearly a differentiation made between the genders in Reish Lakish's statement. Reish Lakish says that women want to be married more than men. And therefore, maybe if Rava had only said this halacha for marriage, it could be the reason it works, even though she's not getting anything. Maybe that's only because every woman is desperate to get married. And therefore, that's why the mechanism works. But by buying and selling, where a seller normally wants to get something for the thing that he's relinquishing, maybe there we would say that the seller has to acquire something in order for the sale to be valid. And if Rava would have only told me this halacha for buying and selling, maybe the reason why the seller doesn't need to get any money is because he can always give away a gift for free. But a woman can't give away herself for marriage for free, and maybe therefore it doesn't work if she's not receiving the cash herself. And therefore, Rava needs to say it in both cases. Let's go weiter. Amar Rava. Hiskatshi lilachatzoi mekudeshes, but chetziech mekudeshes li eina mekudeshes. Rabbi says something very bizarre. He says that if a man says to a woman, "You are hereby married to half of me," so that's a valid. That's what someone else asked this morning. So the Gemara says that that's a valid marriage. But if he says to her, "Half of you is married to me," that's not a valid marriage. So Amar le Abaye l'Rava. So Abai says, I don't understand the distinction you're drawing. What are you going to tell me? The reason why, if a man says to a woman, half of you is married to me, that it's not a valid marriage, is because the Torah says, Ki kachish isha. A man has to marry a whole woman and not a half a woman. But by that argument, hachanami ish amar rachmana v'lo chatzi ish. But the Torah says also ish, ki kach ish isha. A whole man has to marry a woman, not a half a man. So the Gemara says, Amar lei hachi hashta hasam itza lebei trei lo chazi ela gavra mi lo chazi lebei trei v'hachi ka amar la di iboina leminsa v'achriti nasivna. The answer is, says Rabbi, it's not based on the word ish and isha in the pasuk. It's based on the psychology of the matter. A woman can only be married to one man. And therefore, you can't say half of you is married to me so that the other half of you can be married to someone else. That's illicit. That's illegal. That's not possible. And therefore, that's not a marriage. But if a man says to a woman, I want only half of me to be married to you, you're married to half of me, what he's basically suggesting to her is, I plan to marry another wife. Listen, sweetheart, there's plenty of me to go around, right? So half of me will go to you, and half of me will go to another lady.
Only half of the woman in my life.
That's right. That's right. So therefore, that's what he means. And since that's legal, because a man is allowed to have, because bigamy and polygamy is legal in Jewish law, therefore it's a legal marriage. Okay? So Amar le Marzutra Berei. Now, boy, if you go home and tell your wives this Gemara today, you can come over. You can sleep in my house tonight. Amar le Marzutra Berei de Rav Mari le Ravina. V'niv shetula kiddushay bekula. So the question is, so you're telling me if a man says to his wife, half of you is my wife, you're saying it's not a valid marriage, but still there should be a principle of hektish. And it's very interesting because here you see that kiddushin, by definition, has financial aspects and it also has hektish aspects. And here the Gemara is switching midstream. Up until now we've been discussing the financial aspects of a kiddushin, but now we're talking about the hektish halachic aspects of kiddushin. And what are we saying? We're saying as follows. When a man marries a woman, he's making her hektish, in a sense. And we know that the principle of hektish is that if you are makdish a portion of an animal, the entire animal becomes hektish. As we know, milotanya ha'omer ragla shilzu ola tehekula ola. That if a man says, I just want the leg of this cow to be hektish, the entire cow becomes hektish. And because there's a principle that hektish spreads throughout the creature. And so why doesn't that apply to a woman too? When you say to her, half of you is mekudeshes, all of her should become hektish. Va'afilu leman da'amar ein kula ola, hani milihecha demakdish davar she'ein haneshama teluya bo. Avol makdish davar she'haneshama teluya bo havya kula oila. And even though there's an argument over there in the Gemara about when you're makdish just the leg of the animal, but everyone agrees that when you're makdish a vital organ of the animal such that without that organ the animal could not survive, everyone agrees that the hektish spreads to the entire animal. So if you say, let's say the heart of this animal is hektish, then the entire animal is hektish. Right? And so here you're saying half of you is mekudeshes to me. She can't survive with only half a body. So then you should say that she's completely mekudeshes. So the Gemara says, one second, me dummy. You're making an inappropriate analogy. Hasam behema hachadas acheres. He says, in the case of the animal, the reason why hektish spreads to the entire animal is because there's no opposing mentality to maintain a non-hektish status for the rest of the animal. The animal is a dumb animal. It doesn't have intelligence to counter your declaration of hektish to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the body. But over here, if a man says to a woman, half of you will be mekudeshes, her mentality has the ability to maintain the other half of her as being non-hektish. And therefore, since she's only half married, that's not a marriage at all, because a woman has to be totally, completely committed to the husband in order for that to be a marriage. So, halo damya elalaha. So therefore, if you wanted to make an analogy to hektish, the more appropriate analogy would be to the following case. The Amar Reb Yochanan behema shel shnei shutfin. It's really, we're talking about an animal that's owned by two partners, and that's really more analogous to the case we're talking about, where a man wants to be makadesh and isha only half of her, and she'll own the other half of herself, right? So that's really what we're saying. And in the case is, let's say you have Reuven and Shimon are partners in the ownership of a cow, okay? So Reuven goes ahead and says, I hereby declare hektish my half. So the other half that's owned by Shimon does not become hektish because Shimon is a sentient being and his ownership is maintained by him and prevents the half of Reuven's hektish from spreading to Shimon's half. But then Rabbi Yochanan goes further and he says, "V'chazar v'lakcha v'ikdisha kedosha ve'eno kreva." If Reuven goes afterwards, after he's made his half hektish, he buys out Shimon's portion and then makes Shimon's former portion hektish, then the entire animal is hektish, but it cannot be brought as a carbon. Now, why can it not be brought as a carbon? Because since it was temporarily precluded from being a carbon when it was only half hektish, it becomes permanently precluded. We'll see that in just a minute. Va'osa tumura, but it is subject to the laws of tumura. Tumura means that if I take another chulin animal and I say this is instead of this, then both animals are hektish. And utmurasa kayotseba, and the exchange animal is just like the original animal, which means that it's completely hektish, but it cannot be brought as a carbon, just like the original animal. So shma minatzlas, there are three things that we can adduce from this teaching. Number one, shma mina bali chayim nidchim. The first thing that we can adduce is there's a machlokas in Maseches Yoma regarding an animal that was hektish and then was unusable as a carbon and then later became usable. It's called preclusion or dichoy. There's a machlokas as to whether that preclusion needs to take place after shchita, or can the preclusion take place even while the animal is still alive? And everyone agrees that if the preclusion took place after the animal was slaughtered, that for 5 minutes this animal was not usable as a carbon for whatever reason, then it becomes permanently precluded. The machlokas is, what if the animal was precluded for 5 minutes while it was still alive? So there's a machlokas in the Gemara, and here the Gemara seems to be saying that even though the preclusion was for 5 minutes while the animal was alive, it becomes permanently precluded. And another thing we see here, which is a machlokas in Maseches Sukkah, is when the preclusion was at the onset of the animal's kedusha. You see, because one Manda Omer says that the only time that temporary preclusion permanently precludes the animal from being a korban is only in a situation where the animal was first hektish and completely usable as a korban, then afterwards was temporarily precluded, then that temporary preclusion constitutes permanent preclusion. But what we're saying here is like the other Manda Omar, that even though at the onset of its kedusha it was temporarily precluded, that temporary preclusion even at the onset permanently precludes the animal from being brought as a korban. So, ushmamina yeshtichu b'damim. And the third thing that we can deduce from this teaching is that when you have an animal that's owned by two people, and one person declares his half to be hektish, so clearly this animal does not have kedushas haguf. It doesn't have intrinsic kedusha because it cannot be used as a carbon. It only has financial kedusha. Its value is sanctified to the temple, and yet that is sufficient to constitute dichoy, to constitute temporary preclusion, and thereby making it into permanent preclusion, which is in itself a discussion in the Gemara elsewhere. These are all kudshim discussions, so we're going to move on. Now, boi rava, chetziech bechatzi pruta, v'chetziech bechatzi pruta mahu. Another bizarre scenario. A man says to a woman, here's half a pruta for half of you to be mekudeshes, and here's another half a pruta for your other half to be mekudeshes. Is that a valid marriage or not?
I do that.
Well, that's why I said it's bizarre.
The
guy wears bow ties. He's a really weird guy, okay? So he decides he's going to try some kind of shtick to marry the woman. So the question is, Kevin de Amar lachatzi pruta paska odilma mona v'holechu. On the one hand, you could argue that since he's dividing up each half in a half a pruta, so there are two problems with this marriage. One is that he's using a half a pruta, and that's not a valid mechanism. And the second thing is he's only being makadesh half of her. That's also not valid. So that's one, you could say that it's not a valid marriage. On the other hand, you could say that it's valid because maybe this is part of a continual process. Maybe he's just counting out half a pruta, another half a pruta, right? So, in other words, it's part of a continuum to add up to one full pruta for the entire woman. And therefore, maybe it is a valid marriage. Now, imtim salom or moina v'holechu, and if you're going to say that it is valid because it's a continual process of adding to the final pruta, so chetziech bepruta v'chetziech bepruta mahu. What about the next case? What if he says, half of you is married to me with this pruta, and the other half is married to me with this pruta? Here he's using a full pruta for each half of her. So on that argument, you could say, Kevin de Amar la bepruta upruta paskala milse, al dilma kol biyome mona v'holechu. On the one hand, you could say, since he's using a full pruta, you can't say that he's just adding a half a pruta to another half a pruta. He's using the full unit, and he's only marrying half a woman, so you should say that that's invalid. Or no, maybe you could say that since he's doing it on the same day, in the same time frame, he really does mean for that to be a continuum as well, and he's really meaning to marry a full woman with two prutas instead of one pruta. He wants to be a big spender, right? Now, imtim salomer kol biyome mona v'holechu chetzich bepruta hayom v'chetzich bepruta l'machar mahu. And if you're going to tell me that that also is valid because it's part of a continuum, what happens if the guy divides it over 2 days? And he says on day one, he says, this pruta will work today for half of you, and then tomorrow here's another pruta, and that'll work for tomorrow's other half. So since it's broken out over 2 days, Kevin Damer Lamachar Pascha, is that considered to be a break, and therefore it's an invalid marriage because each time he's only marrying half a woman? Odil Mahachi Kamarla, Kiddushin Mitchalu Meha Idna, Umigmar Lo Nigmaru Ad Lamachar. Or maybe what he means to say to her is that, no, I want the Kiddushin to start today, and I want it to continue in a continual process until tomorrow. And therefore he means to acquire all of her, but over a gradual, slow period for some bizarre, strange reason. Okay? Now, Shnei Chetziech Bepruta Mahu. Now, what if he says to her as follows? I have a pruta here, and instead of saying, you are Mekudeshes to me, he says, both halves of you are Mekudesh to me with this pruta. Is that a valid marriage or not? Would you say, Hacha vadai b'chad zimna ka'amarla? Here, it's not even a continuum. He's using one pruta. He wants to marry the whole woman, but he's saying, I want both halves of you to be mekudesh to me. Or maybe on the other hand, a woman cannot be dissected or bisected for purposes of marriage. You have to take the ganze Geschäft. See, normally in math we say 2 halves equals 1 whole, but maybe not in marriage. Maybe you have to only marry the whole woman, or the whole deal is off. So the Gemara says, in all of these questions, take. Let's go on. Next question. Let's say a guy wants a 2-for-1 deal. So he goes over to a man who's he says, I have 2 sons, you have 2 daughters. I want my 2 sons to marry your 2 daughters, but I want a 2-for-1 deal. So here's a pruta, and with this one pruta that I'm laying out on behalf of my sons, your 2 daughters will be married to my 2 sons.
It's a bargain.
Will that work? So basar nosin u'makabel azlinan v'ha'ika mamona odilma basar ditu azlinan v'haleka. On the one hand, you could say that the party is giving out a pruta, and the receiving party is receiving a pruta, the father of the 2 girls who accepts the kiddushin, and so therefore you have the giver giving a pruta, the recipient receiving a pruta, so it's valid kesef kiddushin kinyan. Or maybe no, it's dependent upon the number of people, and since you have 2 people who are marriers and 2 girls who are being married, each one needs a pruta. So the Gemara says, Teiku, we're not sure. So boy Rav Papa, bitcha uparascha bepruta mahu. This is pretty unromantic, but a guy goes over to a fellow and he says, I'd like to acquire your daughter and your cow. So I'd like to marry your daughter, but I want to get a cow in the deal as well.
Maybe he wants to marry the cow.
So, and by the way, here's a pruta. So the question is, will that work? On the one hand, you could say it's not good because he's basically saying your daughter's half a pruta is for your daughter, half a pruta is for the cow. And since you need a full pruta for the girl, it's not going to work. Odilma bitcha bepruta parascha b'meshicha. Or maybe he's saying, no, I'm giving you the whole pruta for your daughter, but I want you to throw in the cow as an add-on, right? As a, what is it called? Sweeten the pot. And I'll just be kona the cow as a gift, and pay nothing for it by just doing an act of mashicha. So the Gemara says, take. We're not sure about that either. So better. Boy Ravashi bitcha v'karkoich bepruta. And the same question, related question, is if the guy wants to acquire the daughter in marriage plus a field of the father. That will be the question. He says, here's a pruta. Bitcha b'chatzi pruta v'karkoich b'chatzi pruta. Is it meaning to say that half the pruta is for your daughter, half the pruta is for the field, and therefore it's no good? O dilma bitcha b'pruta v'karkoich b'chazaka. Or maybe he means to say, here's a full pruta for your daughter, and I want you to just throw in the field, which I'll be kona using the kinyan chazaka, and you'll give it to me as a gift. So there too, the Gemara says teiko.
Is that a different case? Are they just bringing it
It's a different case because the first case is chattel as a throw-in, and the second case is real estate as a throw-in. Hahu gavra da'akdish b'shiroi. Now this has very, very relevant applications in halacha. Under the chuppah, the Masader Kiddushin will require that the ring that is being presented to the girl does not have any stones on it, and he also requires that the Eidim have to be able to easily assess the value of the ring by knowing what is it made out of. Is it tin? Is it aluminum? Is it gold? Is it silver? What is it? Why is that important? Because as we'll see, the woman has to be made aware of the true value of the kesef that is being presented to her. So, and we're talking really now not about cash, we're talking about something that is cash equivalent. A man goes and wants to be Makadesh and Isha with a pile of fabric. And he says, you're hereby married to me with this fabric. So Rabba Amar Lo Tzrichi Shuma, Rav Yosef Amar Tzrichi Shuma. So there's a machlokis, does the woman have to get a professional assessment as to the value of the fabric or not? Rabba says she doesn't need, and Rav Yosef says she does need. So Ida Amar La B'Kol Dehu Kuli Amalo Pligi Delo Tzrichi Shuma. Now, in a situation where the husband says, look, it's definitely prima facie, it's definitely worth a shava pruta, and whatever it's worth, you are hereby married to me. So since he said whatever it's worth and she accepts it, so everyone agreed that it doesn't need to be assessed. And Ida Amar La Chamshin Velo Shavu Chamshin Hai Lo Shavu. And also, if the man makes a false representation and he says this is $50 worth of fabric, and then you later find out that it's not, then everyone will agree that that's not a valid marriage because it's a mekach tos. So what's the issue? So kipligi do omer chamshin v'shavu chamshin. Then the case will be, what if the husband says, I believe this is $50 worth of fabric, but it hasn't been professionally assessed. That's where there's a machlokis. So Rabba Amar Lo Tzrichi Shuma Dahashavu Chamshin. Rabba says it doesn't need to be professionally assessed as long as he's telling the accurate value of the fabric, and she understands how much it's worth. Then that's fine, and therefore it's a valid kiddushin. But Rav Yosef Amar Tzrichi Shuma Kevin Deitzalo Bekia B'Shuma Lo Samcha Daita. But Rav Yosef says no. Even if it turns out that his assessment, his estimation of the value of the fabric was spot on, it was absolutely, it's worth $50. But since she never heard it from an independent assessor, she doesn't have full confidence in the true value of the fabric, and therefore, since she's not really sure, there's not a full commitment. There's some small percentage of reluctance on her part because she's not really sure what it's worth, and therefore it's not a valid marriage according to Rav Yosef until she has the reassurance from the professional assessment agency that this has been evaluated, this fabric as being worth $50. Until then, it's not a method, it's not a proper method of kiddushin.
It's a problem. She might think it's worth more, and then she
might think it's worth more. She might think she's not really sure what it's worth, and therefore she's not completely giving herself over mentally for kiddushin. Some say that Rav Yosef will also say that it's invalid even when the husband says, take it, it's worth something, I don't know how much it's worth, are you willing to accept it? Even if she says yes, there too Rav Yosef will say that it's not a valid kiddushin. And it's not based on misrepresentation, but rather what is it based on? Pligi, that why? Because Omer Shaveh Kesef Arayu Kesef, Ma Kesef Tekayetz Af Shaveh Kesef Nami Tekayetz. That because Rav Yosef says the fact that you could use cash equivalent chattel as a mechanism for kiddushin is because it's subsumed under the category of kesef. So just like kesef, you have to know exactly, when you get the money, you see the denomination of the kesef, you know exactly how much it's worth. Kesef by definition is a finite amount of currency, so too cash equivalent has to also have a finite, definitive amount attached to it in order for it to work as a mechanism of kesef. And therefore, if she doesn't even know how much it's worth, and he doesn't know how much it's worth, it doesn't matter. It could be worth $1 million, but if no one knows the true value of it, according to Rav Yosef in this version, it would not work as a proper method of kiddushin. Again, that's the reason why it's best for each party to know what the material of the ring is, what it's made out of, and therefore have a fairly good understanding of the true value of the ring. Have a wonderful day, a good Erev Shabbos.
Is standard, everyone uses a gold ring?
Today the minhag is for everyone to use a ring.